The year 1398 dawned with a palpable sense of dread across the northern plains of India. Whispers and rumors traveled faster than any caravan, carrying tales of a formidable conqueror from the west. This conqueror was Timur, also known as Tamerlane, the Turco-Mongol emir from Samarkand. His ambition was as vast as the steppes from which his ancestors had emerged. He had already carved out a massive empire stretching across Persia and Central Asia. Now, his gaze was fixed upon the fabled wealth of the Delhi Sultanate. The Sultanate, under the rule of the Tughlaq dynasty, was a shadow of its former self. Internal strife and a war of succession had left it weak and vulnerable. Sultan Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud Shah Tughlaq held a tenuous grip on power. Timur saw this weakness as a divine invitation, a perfect opportunity for conquest. He assembled a colossal army, numbering over 90,000 skilled and ruthless warriors. These were not mere soldiers. They were veterans of many brutal campaigns. In the spring, his grandson Pir Muhammad had already crossed the Indus to lay the groundwork. Pir Muhammad's forces besieged and captured Uchan Multan after a long and arduous siege. Timur himself began his march, crossing the Indus River on September 30th, 1398. His advance was not a simple march, but a wave of destruction. The town of Talamba was one of the first to feel his wrath, its inhabitants massacred. He moved through Punjab, leaving a trail of fire and death in his wake. Local populations were either slaughtered or taken as slaves. Before confronting the main army at Delhi, Timur faced a horrifying logistical problem. His army had accumulated an immense number of captives, nearly 100,000 souls. These were men, women, and children from the towns and villages he had subjugated. Timur feared they might rise up and attack his rear during the decisive battle for Delhi. He consulted his emirs, who shared his concern about a potential rebellion. With chilling pragmatism, Timur gave a terrible and infamous order. Every captive, all 100,000 of them, were to be executed. Chronicler Sharaf al-Din Ali Yazdi noted that even he, a man accustomed to war, was shaken. The massacre was carried out with brutal efficiency over the course of a single day. The ground outside his camp was stained with the blood of the innocent. With his rear secured in the most horrific way imaginable, Timur prepared to meet the Sultan's army. On December 17th, 1398, the two armies faced each other on the plains outside Delhi. The army of the Delhi Sultanate, led by Sultan Mahmud and his commander Malu Iqbal, looked formidable. Their greatest strength, they believed, lay in their corps of war elephants. There were 120 of these colossal beasts, like living fortresses. Their tusks were tipped with poison, and they were covered in chainmail. Howdahs on their backs carried archers and spearmen, ready for battle. The sight of these creatures was intended to strike terror into the hearts of the steppe warriors. Timur, however, was a master strategist, not easily intimidated. He understood that the elephant's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, their propensity to panic. He ordered his men to dig a wide trench in front of their position to break the elephant's charge. He also employed a clever and cruel psychological tactic. He had his camels loaded with bundles of dry wood and hay. As the Indian army advanced, Timur gave the signal. The bundles on the camels' backs were set ablaze. The terrified, burning camels were prodded forward, driven directly towards the enemy's elephant line. The war elephants, confronted by this wall of fire and screaming animals, were thrown into utter confusion. They stopped, trumpeted in fear, and began to turn back. Timur's archers unleashed a storm of arrows, adding to the chaos. The panicking elephants, now completely out of control, stampeded back through their own lines. They crushed their own soldiers under their massive feet, turning victory into a rout. The Sultan's army disintegrated into a terrified mob. Timur's cavalry charged into the broken formations, cutting down the fleeing soldiers. The battle was over almost as soon as it had begun. It was a complete and devastating victory for Timur. Sultan Mahmud and Malu Akbar, saying the disaster, fled the field in disgrace. They abandoned their capital and their people to the mercy of the conqueror. 3 days after the battle, Timur made his triumphal entry into the city of Delhi. He was met by the city's clerics and nobles, who pleaded for mercy. Timur, in a show of magnanimity, accepted their submission and promised to spare the general populace. He agreed that only the households of those who had resisted would be plundered. Contributions were levied upon the wealthy citizens to save the city from a general sack. However, this fragile peace was not destined to last. Timur's vast army, camped within and around the city, was a hungry and restless beast. Soldiers began to aggressively forage for grain and supplies, harassing the citizens. The collection of the levy became increasingly harsh and violent. Scuffles broke out between the soldiers and the people of Delhi. Resistance, born of desperation, began to flare up in different quarters of the city. Some of the city gates were shut by the citizens in a futile act of defiance. When news of this resistance reached Timur, his mood darkened. He felt his authority was being challenged and his mercy repaid with rebellion. He unleashed his entire army upon the city. The order for a general sack was given, and all promises were forgotten. What followed was an orgy of violence, plunder, and destruction that lasted for several days. Soldiers, now unrestrained, poured into every street and every house. The city became a slaughterhouse. Tens of thousands of civilians were indiscriminately murdered. The screams of the dying echoed through the once majestic avenues. No one was spared. Men, women, and children fell to the sword. The Hindu quarters of the city suffered particularly brutal treatment. Houses were set ablaze, and entire districts were consumed by fire. The sky over Delhi turned dark with the smoke of its own funeral pyre. While the killing continued, the systematic plunder of a millennium of wealth took place. Soldiers went from house to house, stripping them of everything valuable. They collected gold, silver, jewels, and precious stones. Fine silks, intricate tapestries, and expensive goods were hauled away. Every soldier, from the highest general to the lowest footman, enriched himself. The chroniclers wrote that some soldiers had so many slaves they did not know what to do with them. Thousands of surviving women and children were enslaved. The city's skilled artisans were a particularly prized category of captives. Timur intended to use their talents to beautify his own capital, Samarkand, Tutsi. Stonemasons, architects, weavers, and other craftsmen were rounded up and prepared for the long journey west. 3 days, the city was a vision of hell on earth. The streets were choked with corpses, making passage difficult. The stench of death and burning hung heavy in the air. Vultures and wild dogs descended upon the city, feasting on the dead. When the frenzy finally subsided, Timur held a victory feast amidst the devastation. He watched entertainments while the city around him was a smoldering graveyard. After 2 weeks of occupying the ruined capital, Timur decided to depart. His army was laden with an unimaginable amount of treasure. He also took with him the captured elephants, now symbols of his complete victory. His return journey was not peaceful. As he continued to raid and pillage on his way to the Ganges, he assaulted Meerut and Haridwar, adding to his trail of destruction. Finally, laden with spoils and slaves, he turned back towards Samarkand. Delhi was left a ghost city, utterly broken. So few people were left alive that the city could not be repopulated for years. Disease followed the massacre, as thousands of unburied bodies decayed in the streets. For months, the city was ruled only by silence and death. The Tughlaq dynasty was shattered beyond repair. It never regained its authority or its former glory. The sack of Delhi created a power vacuum in northern India. This paved the way for regional kingdoms to rise in the subsequent decades. The economic devastation was immense, with trade and commerce grinding to a halt. It would take more than a century for Delhi to truly begin its recovery. The captured artisans, however, brought a new wave of Indian and Persian influence to Samarkand. They contributed to the stunning Timurid architecture that still awes visitors today. The Baikanam Mosque in Samarkand was one such project built with the wealth and labor from India. Timur's invasion was remembered not as a war, but as a cataclysm. It became a dark benchmark in the history of the subcontinent. The memory of the sack was burned into the collective consciousness of the people. Tales of the emir's cruelty were passed down through generations. For Timur, it was just one more conquest in a lifetime of brutal victories. He saw himself as a scourge of God, sent to punish the decadent. The wealth he plundered from Delhi fueled his future campaigns in the West. He would go on to challenge the Ottoman Empire and the Mamluks of Egypt. But the sack of Delhi remained one of his most infamous and destructive acts. The event highlighted the vulnerability of a divided kingdom against a determined conqueror. The sheer scale of the massacre before the battle was unprecedented. It demonstrated Timur's capacity for cold, calculated cruelty. The use of flaming camels showed his inventive and terrifying approach to warfare. The destruction of Delhi was not a byproduct of war, but its very purpose. Timur's goal was to cripple the Sultanate and extract its wealth. In this, he succeeded completely. The once great city was left a hollowed-out shell. Its libraries, full of priceless manuscripts, were turned to ash. Its centers of learning and culture were silenced. The bloody campaign of 1398 served as a horrifying warning to other rulers. It cemented Timur's reputation as one of history's most formidable and brutal conquerors. The scars left on Delhi were both physical and psychological. The name of Tamerlane would evoke terror in India for centuries to come. The conqueror's bloody campaign had achieved its aims, but at a terrible cost to humanity. Wind whispered through the broken arches of the desolate city. Survivors, if any, hid in the deepest cellars and ruins. The great markets were now silent, their stalls overturned and burned. The royal palaces stood as skeletal remains of their former grandeur. Timur's chroniclers dutifully recorded the amount of plunder taken. Each soldier was said to have obtained at least 20 slaves. The journey back to Samarkand was slow, burdened by immense loot. The captured Indian elephants were paraded through the streets of Timur's capital. The sack of Delhi became a legendary tale of terror and might. It marked the violent end of an era for the Delhi Sultanate. The city's spirit, though broken, would one day endure and rise again